Sub-Saharan Africa is a logical, follow-on to our Oceania discussions. But on the other hand, when you think about it, it's really bizarre because we tend to think of continents as, defined areas, defined by physical boundaries. And yet, when you look at Africa, it's basically split into two parts. We saw the earlier section was all the sort of West Asia, North Africa thing, and now we're looking at the rest of the continent. And the reality is, if you actually look at the history and interaction within the continent of Africa, there is no such thing as a North Africa and the rest of the place. It's one entity. People moved across there. You had large political military empires across a lot of this region. The entire division of it into a northern, Mediterranean touching region, if you would, and the rest of it is again a reflection of the European focus of this discipline in the past, and to a certain extent, unfortunately, still today. So on one hand, it reflects a little bit of history, but in many ways, it actually reflects more sort of European-centered views of the world. And even today, when you think about it, people tend to sort of separate the North African region from what happens, from the Sahara South, which is a real mistake because it physically doesn't work that way, and then secondly, politically and ethnically, historically, that's not at all accurate. But it is from the European context. And the classic way you see this is the North African region had a lot of very early military historical ties, and when European colonialism stepped in, it was in the Northern African region that really jumped in a big way. The area from the Sahara South was very late, with the exception of South Africa, very late into the sort of European consciousness, and then very much like Oceania, becomes folded into European colonial empires, more to do with ego than to do with actual, resource extraction or control of populations and labor, et cetera. So it makes it very different when you're looking at South Asia, for example, India and such, and you compare it with Sub-Saharan Africa, you don't see a lot of corollaries. And that's, again, because of the perception of the people who are making the decisions, who are the Europeans largely. So if we look at this region, let's segue over. Northern part of this will be familiar with the earlier part of the semester, and of course your map quiz. We're now getting into the rest of this, but if you notice, there's actually sort of a middle band across this. You have a very, very dry north, you have a relatively dry south, and then you have this equatorial band in the middle, which is in many cases is rainforest. But the key here that really defines Africa is actually, and this is why you have to look at it as a continent, is in some ways it's very, very geologically similar to Australia. This is the other oldest piece of real estate on the planet. It's a very, very old continent. There's very little in the way of mountains or highland. The major highland would be over here with Kilimanjaro. But most of this is very, very low. It's very flat. So it's like Australia. The huge difference is because it's in the equatorial belt, it gets a lot more water, it gets a lot more rain than Australia does. But in many other regards, they're very, very similar. This whole section here, the whole equatorial region, is for all intents and purposes, I suspect, probably less than 300 or 400 feet above sea level, the entire region, which, is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it. Another thing to note, just sort of as a discussion point, when they were originally doing continental plate theory and the idea of the continents are actually sort of pieces that slide around on the viscous surface of the planet, the original argument that was made was actually here, and you can see this, was that the east coast of South America fits very nicely into here in the sort of the southwest coast of Africa. And they actually were part of the same thing. In fact, visually, if you look at this, you can actually see that they separated. Here's actually what you might call, for lack of a better term, the stretch marks. That was the two parts separated, and the South American continent moved to the west. The African continent, I believe, is largely stable. I don't really know. You'd have to check. I can't remember if I don't think it's moving, if very much, if at all. So it's a very, very old piece of real estate. It's very complex geologically. And what this means is, like Australia, you have enormous amounts of mineral resources. And also, like Australia, these are pretty hard to access. In Australia's case, it's just because it's, forbidding, dry terrain. Here in Africa, what you find is a large amount of your resources. Oil's up here, you have oil down here, you have enormous mineral resources all throughout the central region, even into the south. So again, like Australia, it's an area that has enormous resources and potential, but ironically, when colonialism starts up in large part for much of this area in the 18th, 19th century, they don't really realize they have the resources, or maybe if they had them, they didn't know how to get them. So it really is until the mid-late 20th century that the resource wealth of Sub-Saharan Africa sort of comes into general consciousness. And ironically, for the Europeans, by that time, most of this area has gained independence. So you're left with countries that, like their oceanic counterparts, but even more so, have not a particularly strong sense of self-identity, because when you look at these country boundaries in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're basically reflective of European colonial boundaries in most cases. They're not reflective of ethnicity. They're not reflective, even in many cases, of physical features. It's just like the Germans had this place, the British had this place, the French had this place, and they drew a line on a map. And so these lines tend to be very artificial. This is especially true here. And so they don't reflect, identity of the population on the ground. And in the late 20th, 21st century, when what you have is sort of this, independence movement that's a reaction to European colonialism, as in other parts, but even more so in this region. First, everyone agrees they want the Europeans out. But then once you've got the Europeans out, and I mentioned this before in other regions, is then you start looking at each other and thinking, well, why should Benin be a country? The folks in the north are an entirely different language, culture group than the folks in the south. And, the folks in the north might be the majority population, but maybe they don't have political control, but they're sort of like, well, we should be in charge. In other words, now that they've got the Europeans out, we want our own country. And this sort of semi-ethnically driven nationalism is a huge part of conflict. I believe there's roughly 12 or 14 civil wars, for all intents and purposes, going on in Sub-Saharan Africa as we speak. And they're invariably driven by a combination of ethnic identity, the idea for sovereignty, and also nationalism, and in many cases also a rather cynically control the resources and wealth. This is an area that's in a lot of conflict, most famously probably Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, but I mean, you can pretty much pick, any out of any three countries here, one or two will be in conflict. I believe 7 of the countries here in the southwest corner are currently in civil wars or have warlords that have recently taken power in the last couple of years and hold it very fragilely. So this is an area where you see a lot of people shooting each other. This is the area that in the 20th, 21st century has become incredibly, sadly famous for genocide. Because you have an attitude in many of these areas, if I have a minority group as another group, I don't see why I should share the resources with them. So let's either get them to leave. If they won't leave, then just get rid of them. And so, human rights violations in Sub-Saharan Africa are sort of mind-blowing just in terms of the list and the length of the list and the number of groups in the list. It's very typical to have groups that are basically genocide that turn around and then genocide another group. So this is a really brutal region in that regard. And that has to do with the fact that they didn't, the political social empires that made up this region over the last, say, 1,000 years completely collapse and disappear under the impact of European colonialism, which again was entirely arbitrary and driven by folks in Paris or Berlin or London. And then when those folks leave, you end up with this huge vacuum, which has not resolved itself well. Now, what you also have in there is like Southeast Asia, well, actually more like Oceania, what you find is in this region, is the Europeans, basically in this region south of the Sahara, really aren't interested in spending a lot of money because, again, remember, this is largely ego colonialism. So what you find is, one, their attitude towards folks that they see as Black or African is incredibly negative. So that's one reason not to spend money. 2 is they don't receive any return on their investment. So that's another reason not to spend money. And so the end result of all this is basically what you have is for the European control of this region, there's very little political stability they bring in. There's very little education they bring in. There's really very little they leave to most of this region for the 100, 200 years that they controlled it. And in some cases, for example, this Western region, 300 or 400 years. And a real good example would actually be Liberia. Liberia is a series of localized ethnic states. The United States comes in late 17, early 1800s. In other words, when the United States is just first forming. And what you have as an issue in, especially the northeastern part of the United States, is you have what were called free Blacks, which were basically African Americans who were no longer slaves, but the Anglo-American population really didn't want them around, didn't know what to do with them. So what they come up with, and this was actually and also supported by African Americans, some African Americans at the time, was what was called the Back to Africa movement. And so what they do is they actually, literally at gunpoint, sort of take over this whole chunk of the southwest coast of Africa, which is where part of the slave trade had been generated. And they basically start up a movement to move free African Americans back to what they call Liberia after the liberty, for the purpose of, basically providing a black state for blacks so that you can get rid of blacks in North America, specifically the United States. It's an absolute failure. It was, very cynically driven right from the get-go. Pretty much any African American support fails at the beginning. But the United States still has an enormous amount of influence and influence in this region. And you see this classically in the fact that the capital is called Monrovia after President Monroe, who was president at the time a lot of this was going on. And so you find a lot of names here that if you look will actually be important Americans at that point in time who were in one way or another seen as responsible for trying to set up this, back to Africa state in the continent of Africa. Very typical of the lack of knowledge of the place, because the folks that were African American might have been sold here, but they were generally from the interior part of Africa. So this isn't their home. They're not that ethnic group. Of course, by 100-something years later, none of them spoke the language. They had no relation with Liberia any more than sending some Americans from Des Moines, Iowa, back to Frankfurt or some other place in Norway or something like that, because their parents had come over there 200 years earlier. It was a very bizarre idea. It was a very typical idea. It was hugely popular in North America and the United States for almost 20, 30 years. But its main function for our purpose in this class is just the fact that it shows the lack of understanding or interest in the realities of Africa in any way, shape, or form. Again, very similar to what we saw with Oceania. So when you look at this place physically, again, probably the most fascinating feature is the Sahara. The Sahara is largely what we call a stony desert. So most of the Sahara isn't, the classic sort of, sand dunes and camels and such like that with Berbers running around on them, or Tuaregs, I guess, more accurately. What it actually is a stony desert. And that's because what you find is, again, remember, most of this continent is flat. So you're not going to have rivers running quickly through this. You're not going to have the equivalent of European rivers or, say, Asian rivers or North American rivers. Water here tends to sort of sit. And a lot of this area actually consists of what were formerly lakes, basically trapped interior lakes, similar to Lake Baikal. And so what happens is when we get that massive shift in climate that so destroyed the southern part of the Roman Empire up here in the north, that also sort of radically changes this whole area. The Sahara has been growing rapidly over the last 5,000 to 6,000 years. and about 2,000 years ago, when that climate change whacked this area, that just accelerated this process. So every year the Sahara grows to the south, and of course it's creeping up, pretty much swallowed the north. So the Sahara is actually one of the largest physical features on the planet, sense of land features, and it's a rapidly growing feature. This is a combination of natural, attributes. And once you get a large enough, extremely dry land area that gets very little in the way of rain, it can actually sort of, grow on its own, as it were. And secondly is the fact that human influence in this region in terms of over farming, over logging, over this and over that, has just exacerbated it. So it's a combination of what we call anthropocentric and sense of human-driven, but also natural phenomena. This particular area, the Sahara itself, the Central Sahara region, was never a major area of human influence and human activity. So it's not an anthropocentric area in the sense that people made the Sahara. The Sahara is a natural feature. Its growth is a combination of natural and human influences. That has huge political impacts, because what that means is places like Mali and Niger, they used to be, fairly rich agricultural areas. Mauritania also find themselves, rapidly sort of turning into dust. Chad also, as this climate change is occurring, and they're not really too sure. Well, in some cases, they're not really too sure what to do about it. In other cases, the political will isn't there, because in many cases, your populations that have political control aren't necessarily the ones that are facing the environmental crisis at the present. And in sad ways, this is probably a really good mindset for people to understand when they talk about dealing with climate change. You can't have just global will. You have to have local will. You have to have, national, regional will. that plays across the spectrum of political, social influences, or else nothing's going to happen. What you get down here then is you end up with this massive area of rainforest. If I actually zoom in here a little bit, you can see when you look at these rivers, for example, they're very slow moving. They're very, very shallow. They have enormous amounts of zoom in more. You just look at this particular section of the Congo, for example. The fact that it has all these braids, we call it, that it has, the river just takes all these different courses, is because it's so flat, there really isn't sort of a, major river. It can pretty much go wherever it wants to, and the floodplain for the Congo basically extends for almost 100 miles in any direction to the side. So what that means is, building towns around here, putting up roads, any infrastructure around the Congo is pretty much, had better be flood-proof because it's going to get wet. And because this whole area is very, very shallow, in the sense that it's very shallow and it's also very flat, it also means that you can't use the rivers. So unlike our European rivers or Asian rivers, as we'll see the North American rivers, it's very hard to move good resources up the rivers in Sub-Saharan Africa, because in many cases they might be, a couple of miles wide and 15, 20 feet deep. So you can't move, large vessels up there. And also they just change direction, you can imagine. How do you move a large ship with containers or barges or something up something like this? It changes course every couple of months or a year. Another heavy rain comes in during the tropical monsoon season, and all this changes. And so that means that despite the fact that you have rivers, that really doesn't leave you a lot of positives in terms of what you're going to do with the rivers. So the rivers here, the closest parallel would be sort of Russia. The rivers in this region act as barriers or as problems. They don't act as accessibility transport hubs. And when you combine it with the fact that what you've got here is basically tropical vegetation, again, largely wet, a very heavy monsoon season, combined with these rivers that flood. If you notice, one thing that's missing here is we don't see any roads, and that's not accidental. It's very hard to have roads, except for a few that you punch through, because it's incredibly difficult to make roads and keep roads functional in this region. If you look here, you've got this major road comes up here and it just comes to a halt. And the reason very simply is that you can't build a large settlement here, because if you do, it's going to get flooded out. You can see where people have basically turned this into agricultural land. But here you've got a major road that just sort of comes to a staggering halt because they can't figure out how to get across the river, because every time the river floods, it's a different river. So this is a part of the world where engineering in the 2020s hasn't come up to solutions with just the physical attributes of this particular area. So that means that much of this area, if you look at here, is just staggeringly isolated. It's not that it doesn't have people, it has tons of people in it, but they do not have access to the outside world in large part. If they do, it's very controlled. And notice how it literally stops, largely at the rivers. You can just see the rivers are like giant barriers here. And you end up with developed areas around them that have access. And outside of that, you've got, a big question mark. So it's not, this used to be called back in the European colonial period, Darkest Africa. Now, in part, that was just sort of a play on words for the fact that you had Africans living in here. But it also just was in part due to the fact that communications were almost non-existent. This is where Dr. Livingston, whatever his name was, disappears and Stanley has to go find him. Huge fascination to Europeans in the period. This is where he had expeditions. You still today even have rumors that, guys go into this region, they find stuff that no one's ever seen before, because it's just so hard to get there. So it's an area that the tropical aspects of this area just make it incredibly difficult to access. And then when you're up in the south, you end up in large, again, desert regions as we move into the southern area or near desert regions. And again, what you have is your driving energy here, of course, is back to the source side to mineral wealth. The huge difference is mineral wealth is more accessible here because you don't have the forest. So if you notice, you have a slightly more sophisticated road net, for a bunch of reasons we're going to next time. But the reality is again, you still have large areas. If you look at this, where all of a sudden, the roads just sort of stop, and then you're into this sort of big nothing. And again, remember, these big nothings have lots of people in them. They just don't have access to stuff that's resources, which also means they can't get involved in trade. You're not going to find a Walmart or a Starbucks or something out here, because guess what? There's no way to get the stuff to fill in the store here. So they don't have access to a lot of the stuff we just take as normal. And that's important to remember when you're looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, is it's very low accessibility. and very expensive to put in the accessibility.